So we're going to dismiss the first hour class. Children, you can go to your class. And at the same time, you would turn around and greet one another. Good morning, all. All right, we're going to go back to our scripture reading this morning. It's found in Esther 1. So please follow along as I read. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his disciples, for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast, lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king, and drinking was according to his edict. There is no compulsion, for the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbana, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring King Vashti before the king with royal crowns, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and judgment, the men next to him being Karshena, Sheshvat, Amatha, Tarsus, Mersus, Marcina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face and sat first in the kingdom. According to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs? Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against the officials and all the peoples who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women in Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. If it pleases the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti will never again come before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. This advice pleased the king and the princess, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household, and speak according to their language, to the language of his people.
Thanks, Harry. Good morning, everyone. Great to be with you. I'm excited this morning because we are starting this new series in the book of Esther. Many of you, I know, were here during our preaching series through the book of Daniel. And I thought that this would be a great follow-up to the book of Daniel to kind of take advantage of all that background that we laid out when preaching through the book of Daniel, because this time period of Esther is basically the same time period as that of the book of Daniel. So many of you will probably remember that in Daniel, it occurred during a time in Israelite history called the exile. And essentially, because of their sin and idolatry of the Israelite people, God ordained the king Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire to go in and conquer Jerusalem. And as a result, many in Jerusalem were taken from their homeland, including Daniel, and were brought to Babylon. And this is the time period called the exile. There was no temple sacrifice, there's no king in Israel, right? They were in exile in Babylon. But as we saw at the very end of Daniel, if you remember this, that the exile came to an end after 70 years, just as God said that he would, that it would. And under Cyrus, right, the very first group of Israelites were able to return back to their homeland of Israel. So the first group to return home was under the leadership of Zerubbabel. Right, this guy named Zerubbabel. It's a really fun name to say, Zerubbabel. And you can read all about that in Ezra chapters 1 through 6. And Ezra tells us that a little over 42,000 Israelites went back in this first return home from the exile. Now, it's actually really important for us to realize that not all the Israelites returned. Some Israelites actually decide to stay in Persia. And we know this because there was a second return 80 years later under Ezra, and Ezra came back in the second return. We can read about that in the second half of Ezra. And then 14 years after that, Nehemiah came back, right, with a group of people as well, and that's about 14 years after Ezra. And basically, this account of Esther, and we know this because it's really easy to map out the kings, right? They always told us who was reigning on the throne. It's really easy to map out exactly when everything happened. And this account of Esther falls in between the first and second return, right? So when Zerubbabel came back with the 42,000, there's an 80-year period before Ezra came back. And this book of Esther basically falls in between that time period. And one of the questions I think we have to answer right off the bat is, now, why didn't all the Israelites return? Right, why is there even a book of Esther? Right, why do we even have to read about Jews that were still in the Babylonian Empire or the Persian Empire? Right, why didn't everybody return home? Right, in some ways, we have to ask the question, were they being disobedient to God? Right, were they not following God by not coming back to Israel? Now, one reason they might have stayed is because, God actually told them in Jeremiah 29, and some of you may remember this, is that when you go to Babylon, right, instead of just like moping around for 70 years and being sorry for yourself because you're in exile, God told them, hey, when you go to Babylon, right, you should build houses, plant gardens, start families, seek the welfare of the city that you are going to. And so it seemed likely that there were probably a lot of Jews that got really comfortable in Babylon and Persia, right? They had homes, they had jobs, they had families, and they didn't want to go back to Jerusalem. Right? In fact, some of them probably had some like really nice homes and some really cushy jobs in Persia, and we know this because even like Nehemiah, right, was really, really high up in the Persian government. And so were they disobeying God by not returning back to Israel? Right, is the question. And it's hard to say because the Bible doesn't give us there's no line in the Bible that tells us directly, right, that they're being disobedient or they're being sinful. But I think I would lean towards saying yes, right, that it probably is God's intention, right, for all his people. There's no mention of Jewish law, right, and in sharp contrast to Daniel, there's actually not a single supernatural miracle that happens in the entire book of Esther. I think this is part of the brilliance of Esther, right? Why is there no mention of God in the book of Esther? I think part of the reason for that is because this is about a group of Jews that were not practicing close relationship with God. Right? God is not mentioned because they weren't closely following God. Unlike today where we can worship God through Jesus, Right, back in the Old Testament, it was not so, right? The worship of God was facilitated completely through the temple. So without the temple, it's impossible for them to practice close fellowship with God. Right? Without the temple, they couldn't obey the laws, right, that God had set out for them. And so I think this leads to one of the big questions in Esther is, will God continue to be faithful to a group of people who are unfaithful to him? Right? Will God continue to care for a group of people that don't seem to prioritize God in their lives? Right? Will God continue to love this group of people that are not walking in obedience to him? Right? And as we go through the book of Esther, what we'll see is that the answer to all those questions is a resounding yes. In fact, you might even say this is the story of the whole Bible. Right? God is faithful to those who are unfaithful to him. And so, as I was thinking about Esther and I was thinking about Daniel, right, in many ways they're like complete opposites. Right? Daniel is exemplary, right? He's walking with God, he obeys God, he boldly lives out his faith, right? Even if it will cost him his life, which we see his life being put in danger multiple times. But yet Esther is the story of a group of Jews who are walking in disobedience, right? By not going back to Jerusalem, even after the exile is over. But yet, what's the main constant between Daniel and Esther? Right? It's really the faithfulness of God. And, in some ways, it's really hard for us maybe to relate to Daniel. Right? Maybe when we're going through Daniel, it's like, man, he's just like a really solid dude. He's just, living his faith out in public, not shy about who he was, and even if it cost him his life, he was willing to, live for God. In some ways, it's kind of maybe hard to, for us to relate to Daniel. But perhaps it's not hard for any of us, right, to relate to Esther or the people in Persia during this time, right? Maybe we aren't all that obedient, right? Maybe we aren't running after God as hard as we should be, right? Maybe we're also distracted by the things of this world. Maybe we are also, in some ways, compromised in our faith. But yet, as we'll see throughout the book of Esther, right, is God's hands at work, continually caring for a group of people that are unfaithful to him. And so in many ways, this is where we get the theme of our book, as you can see here, God's faithfulness in ordinary events. Right? And as I mentioned before, there's nothing supernatural about the book of Esther. It's just the author of Esther listing out, this is what happened. But yet, through the book of Esther, and part of its brilliance is that it shows us that God is at work behind the everyday grind of our lives. As we go day in, day out, that God is at work in these ordinary events. So I might just give one last comparison to the book of Esther. In many ways, you can compare the book of Esther with the book of Exodus. Now, I don't want to spoil Esther for you in case you don't know what happens or you don't remember what happens because it's been so long, since we read it in the past. But basically, at the end of the book of Esther, Esther saves the Jewish people from complete destruction. Right? There's a guy that wants to destroy all the Jews in the Persian Empire. Right? Kind of similar to Exodus in the sense that there was a Pharaoh who wanted to enslave all the Israelite people. And unlike Exodus, right, there's no thunder, there's no lightning, there's no flashy 10 plagues, there's no staves turning into snakes, there's no rivers of blood, there's no parting of the Red Sea. Right? None of that happens, yet just the same, God places just the right people at just the right time in just the right place to save God's people from assured destruction. Right, and one of the most important verses in the book of Esther is Esther 4:14, and hopefully, maybe I'll say it enough that we'll have it memorized. But this is where Mordecai, and we'll introduce Mordecai later, but Mordecai says to Esther, "And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Right, Esther is debating, whether or not she should risk her life in order to potentially save the Israelite people. Right, and Mordecai is saying to her, "Hey, who knows? Maybe God has placed you where you are for such a time as this." Right? But in this series of all these ordinary events, nothing's supernatural happening. In the same way, perhaps God is saying to us, right, that God is placing you at just the right time, at just the right place to accomplish his purposes in the world. I mean, if you think about life, there's only specific people that you have access to. right? Every single one of us here. There's specific people in each of our lives that we have access to that nobody else does. Right? And because only you, have your network of friends and family and work and relatives and whatnot, no one else has the exact same network as you do. And who knows, right? Perhaps God is placing you at just the right time, at just the right place to accomplish his purposes in the world today. Most of the time, it's not going to be some big supernatural event that will signal to us that we should act and we should obey. Right, but it's going to be through the mundane, right, through the ordinary events of life, where you might discover exactly what God's purpose for you is. Right, and so that's the theme of Book of Esther, right? It's God's faithfulness in ordinary events. And all throughout the Book of Esther, we're going to see God's hand at work through the mundane, boring aspects of life. Yet God is using this group of people who are unfaithful to him to accomplish his purposes in the world. So I think that's sufficient enough for an introduction, and let's spend the rest of our time looking at this chapter 1, because there's a lot of things that we can draw out here. Chapter 1 is really the setup, right? It's the setup to the rest of the book of Esther, and the author is going to introduce for us the kingdom of Persia. Right, he's going to introduce to us the king of Persia, and he's going to give us like a really good overall atmosphere of what it must have been like to live in Persia at that time. So let's take a look starting in verse 1. It says, "Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his throne," notice that instead of Ahasuerus, which is really hard to say, Ahasuerus, you'll see it translated as King Xerxes, because Ahasuerus was basically his name in Hebrew, where Xerxes is basically what he's more commonly known as, which is the Greek version of his name, right? All the history books have him listed as King Xerxes, and so the NIV, being a little bit more reader-friendly, puts in King Xerxes instead of Ahasuerus. And so from now on, I'm just going to say King Xerxes. Hopefully that's okay with you, but it's the same person, but Xerxes is just way easier to say. And also it's what his name is historically known as King Xerxes. All right, so King Xerxes, he was throwing this huge feast, right, for all of his nobles and governors, and altogether this feast lasted 180 days. I mean, that is quite the party. I know, I'm sure people in our day can throw some pretty extravagant parties, right? I think there's like Netflix shows about like parties that, rich people throw and lasting like weeks. But I've never heard of a party lasting 6 months, 180 days straight of partying. And the interesting is, like, historically, we actually know why King Xerxes was throwing this feast, right? Why was he doing all this? Well, if you notice in the text, right, it says that the army of Persia and Media and all the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him. Specifically, he brought in all of his army people. And we don't know this from the historical text, although we know this from the history books, that why was he throwing this party? Well, if you take a look at this map, if I can show you a map, I'm going to show you a map because I like maps. But it says that his kingdom reigned from India, which is all the way over there to the east, to Ethiopia, which is south of Egypt. And so this is his kingdom at the time when Xerxes was reigning. And what did he not have conquered? Well, if you can see the little green over there in the corner, he didn't have Greece was left unconquered. And so his father, King Xerxes' father, tried to conquer it and failed. And so Xerxes, at this point in his life, his main goal in life was to conquer Greece. He's like, I'm going to walk over there and I'm going to conquer Greece. And so the way that he does it is that he throws this feast, right? So he calls all the governors and the army people, he wines and dines them, basically as an effort for them to go back to their provinces and muster up as many people as possible so they can kind of march on over and conquer that tiny little peninsula of Greece, right? And so he's throwing this big party, everyone's coming, and he says, go home, muster up as many people as you can, let's go over and conquer Greece. And of course, in history, we know that this is one where some of the great battles, in history happened between the Greeks and the Persians, right? And there's some great stories. For example, the 300 Spartans, the story of the 300 Spartans, right, also comes out of this battle between the Greeks and the Persians. And so this is the reason for the party, right? King Xerxes is trying to muster up this great army to take over Greece. Now, the thing about Esther is that, and I won't go into all the details, but it's pretty certain that Esther herself didn't actually write the book of Esther. And we think that because there's literary clues within Esther that points us to the fact that whoever wrote the book of Esther kind of knew everything that happened already, and they're kind of looking back at past events. And the reason why this is important is because the original audience of the book of Esther would have known the results of this war. Right? The original readers who are reading the book of Esther, they would have already known who won between the Greeks and the Persians. Right? And spoiler alert, the Greeks win. Persia and Xerxes never manages to conquer Greece. Right? And so 4 years later, King Xerxes would return home with his entire army, entire wealth completely depleted. And because this book was written to a group of people, right, that already knew the results of the war, there is a deep, deep irony that we have to appreciate here when we read this first chapter. Because the author of Esther is essentially saying, right, hey, Xerxes, what good is all this wealth that you have? Right, Xerxes, what good is all this, all this power that you have? What good, you threw a 6-month party? Well, that's cool. But look at where you are now. Still, you couldn't conquer that little island of Greece. Right, this whole thing is written, like the author of Esther could have been like, oh, by the way, this is the Xerxes that didn't conquer Greece. Instead, he goes out into this whole extravagant, look at their wealth, look at all that they have. Right, but as the reader of Esther, they would have known, despite all that, right, they still weren't, King Xerxes was still miserable. And so if you kind of look at it, the author almost goes out of his way to detail the extravagance of this party, right? It says like there were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels of different kind, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. Right, so the author didn't really have to go out of his way to explain all this, but he does it to make a point. Right, he does it to say, what good is all that wealth? Right, what good is all that power? What good is all that extravagance? Because yet, despite all that, look at the folly of it. Right, look at how miserable King Xerxes still is. Look at how King Xerxes still is unable to accomplish the goals that he set out before him. When I was in middle school, my family and I took a vacation to Rome. Actually, it was one of those Chinese tours. It was actually pretty miserable. We visited 21 countries in 19 days. Or no, 21 cities in 19 days. I don't recommend it. Don't go on Chinese tours. It was really tiring. Every day was drive for 6 hours, stop for 10 minutes to look at a cathedral, drive for 6 hours, stop for 10 minutes and look at a cathedral, a lot of cathedrals, and then go to sleep, wake up next morning at 6 a.m. and do it again, and it was exhausting. So anyways, and so we were in Rome, and then we actually had to fight the tour guy to go into the Colosseum, because he just drove past the Colosseum, and he's like, on your right, you see the Colosseum. And we're like, no, we want to stop. And he's like, no, we got to get to our next point. And we're like, no, we're stopping. And so actually we kind of I don't know why I'm sharing this, but we kind of held this mutiny, and we're like, there's 20 of us that are going to go in. You're not leaving us. He's like, if you miss the bus, we're gonna leave. And then no, there's 20 of us that are going in, and you're not leaving us. And then he was like, all right, fine, we're not going to leave you. So anyway, so that's completely irrelevant. But 20 of us went into the Colosseum, to actually go see it. And it was kind of pretty cool. Because when we were in the Colosseum, right, they were telling us about all this extravagance, right? This is what happened here. Think about all the thousands, tens of thousands of people that are gathered here, and just think of the pomp and circumstance, right, that would happen in this arena. And yet, when we walk in, what is it now? Right? What is the Colosseum now? Right? It is just a tourist attraction, and at the time, the Roman people probably thought that their empire would last forever. Right? When they walked in the Colosseum, they probably thought, man, this building is going to stand the test of time. This building is going to last forever. Look at this. Look how great it is. But yet, as we look back in history now, we see that it's a reminder. Right? The Colosseum, in some ways, is a huge reminder for us. Right? That whatever power, whatever wealth, whatever extravagance that people had, it doesn't last. It doesn't stand the test of time. And that's the point I think the author is trying to make, right? Because the readers of Persia would have known that Persia is unable to conquer Greece. And so it's trying to say that, yes, they're able to throw some extravagant parties. But likewise, the kingdom of Persia also does not stand the test of time. I know this... Sorry. I know this might age me a little bit, but I remember growing up watching the show Cribs on MTV. Some of you may remember this. It's basically a show about how, the rich and famous spend their millions of dollars. And, you just go in and look at their extravagant homes. Actually, I looked it up this past week. The show is actually still going on. Can you believe that? They're on season 19 right now. I guess there's never a shortage of famous people and their houses, right, that you can go visit. And so, it was fun watching that show, but in some ways, after watching that show, right, it's hard not to feel at least a little envious, right? It's hard not to feel a little discontent, right, with the things that you have. Right, you look at their houses, you look around at your house and your living room, and you're just like, I wish it could be a little bit better, right? And right, this is what the author of Esther is trying to show us, right? Don't be fooled by all that wealth and power. Don't be fooled by all that extravagance. Because will they be able to stand the test of time? But not only that, are they happy? Are they, what does it really look like to find joy in life? You see, there's only one kingdom, right? There's only one kingdom that will actually be everlasting upon everlasting, right? And what the book of Esther is going to do is it's going to invite us to compare the kingdom of Persia with the kingdom of God. Right, and one of the things that makes the kingdom of God so different is that the way that it treats wealth and power. Right, we see how King Xerxes does it, but we also see how Jesus treats wealth and power. Right, for King Xerxes, wealth and power is to be hoarded, right, and be used for personal gain. But yeah, Jesus shows us a different way, right? Because Jesus actually shows us real power by being a servant. Right, Jesus shows us true strength through repentance, right, admitting that you are weak. Right, Jesus shows us real love by being a sacrifice. Jesus shows us real wealth, actually, by being generous. You see, which kingdom are we living for? Right, which values are we espousing in our lives? Right, are we kind of like the kingdom of Persia, where we try to gain power the way Xerxes does, and we try to control everyone around us? Right, or do we use the power that God has given to us? Right, for the sake of others. Right? Jesus shows us real power, that real power actually comes through repentance. And real power actually comes through admitting that you are weak. Right? Because it actually takes real strength to admit your weaknesses. One of my kids, I won't tell you which one, has a really hard time saying sorry. At some point I'm going to have to stop using my kids as an illustration, or I guess I would ask for their permission first, before I do it. But I have a certain kid that I have has a really hard time saying sorry. And we would sit with this particular kid for 20 minutes, right? And he still wouldn't say sorry. And so it'll just be like, hey, listen, you have to say sorry. And then, he'll instead walk over and give his brother a hug and give his sister a hug. And we're like, no, you have to say the words. You have to say sorry. And then he'll be like, give the toy back and then all that. And it's like, no, you have to say the words. For 20 minutes, he'll just sit there crying, refusing to say sorry. And so I'm looking at him, like, come on, what's so hard? Just say the word, just spit out the word sorry. And yeah, I can sometimes relate to him as well, right? In some ways, it's actually really hard for adults, to also say sorry. And in some ways, I don't blame him, right? Because it's really hard to admit that you're wrong. It's hard for adults to admit that we're wrong, right? So what Jesus shows us, right, true power, true strength, actually comes from admitting our weaknesses, right? And, so you can try to gain wealth the way Xerxes does, right? And hope to one day throw parties and purchase a palace and be extravagant. But Jesus actually shows us it's actually through generosity and giving your money away that you gain a wealth, that you gain a richness that money, ironically, can't buy. Right? The paradox of the Christian life is that the very thing that you want, right, the very thing that you want can only be yours when you're willing to give it away. Right? And this is what the book of Esther is trying to show us. Right? And when we think about this Persian army, right, we tend to think of it as strong and mighty and powerful and wealthy. But the book of Esther is trying to show us, don't be fooled by all that. Right? Because it is much better to live your life based on the values of God's kingdom, right, than to live your life based on the kingdoms of this world. Now, if you think the Book of Esther is done poking fun at the Persian royalty. Actually just gets worse from here because there's extravagance right in the first half of chapter Esther 1, but then things actually get worse in the second half of this chapter. So King Xerxes makes this humiliating request, right? And all it took, as we're going to see, is for one woman to say no. And that caused this national crisis in the kingdom of Persia, right? And once again, the author of Esther is trying to show us, right? Look at the foolishness of the kingdom of the world. All right, so let's take a look at the second half of Esther chapter 1. So really quickly, so in verse 10, it says, "On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman." By the way, I just think that that's like the funniest translation of a name. Unfortunate translation. It's like, hey, who are you? Oh, I'm Mehuman. So anyway, so Mehuman, Betsuda, Harbona, Bigtha, Agbekatha, Zechar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served at the presence of the king Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But then so basically, right, they're asking Queen Vashti, come to the party. Let me show you all. Let me show all the servants, right, your beauty. But then verse 12, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. All right, so first of all, it's a little bit overkill, I think, to send 7 servants to go fetch the queen. But King Xerxes doesn't do anything without pomp and circumstance, and so off they go. And now, when it says he requested the Queen Vashti to come before the king with her royal crown, right? You see that there in verse 11. Some rabbis have actually interpreted this to mean for the queen to come into the banquet hall wearing only her royal crown. So we can't be sure that's actually the right interpretation, but either way, and the only reason why King Xerxes, right, is making this request is so that he can look good. Right? He wants to show all of the peoples the beauty of his wife. And he doesn't actually care that it's going to result in the humiliation of Queen Vashti. Right? He doesn't care that it's going to be shameful for Queen Vashti to do this. He's only doing this because he wants to look good. Right? So not to be subjected to this humiliation, Queen Vashti says no. Now, the whole thing could have just ended right here, but no, this triggers a national crisis. Right? So take a look at verse 16. Then Memucan, not to be confused with Mehuman. Mehuman is the eunuch. Memucan is the wise man. And so Memucan said in the presence of the king and his officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against the officials and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt. And since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath and plenty. I mean, don't you think you're overreacting a little bit here? What started out as just a little conflict between 2 people, granted they're the king and queen and they're very important, but Memucan believes that contempt and wrath will spread across every single marriage in the kingdom. God forbid women will be emboldened to say no to their husbands. Just such a crisis, everyone's going to do this, and it's going to be terrible. Now, what's worse, so you have to see the humor in this. So what's worse is everyone agrees with him, right? He brings this before, and everyone says, oh, that's a great idea. So in verse 20, so when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. Makes me feel like they don't really know men and women very well. So this advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in his own script, in his own handwriting, to every people in its own language, and every man be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. The humor in this, and you have to see this, maybe some other sermon, we'll talk about the humor of Esther and why that's actually so important in dismantling, and this is why comics are really important, and stuff like that. So one commenter actually said that Esther is the beginning of Jewish humor, right? And so we have to kind of see it in this way. But what's so, sad and funny at the same time is that the greatest thing that King Xerxes was afraid of is that people will find out that Queen Vashti dared to say no to him. Right? That was his greatest fear. Like, what if other people find out Queen Vashti actually said no to something that I said? And so what does he decide to do? He decides to send a letter in his own handwriting to every single province in Persia, letting them know what Queen Vashti has done. Right? The very thing he wanted to cover up, he managed somehow to tell everybody all by himself. Right, and similar to the previous point, right, we see the foolishness, right? It's trying to show us just how foolish the kingdoms of this world can be. And once again, we see the paradox of the Christian life. Right, King Xerxes wanted everyone to respect him. Right, but the thing about respect is as soon as you demand others to respect you, right, at that very moment, you've lost a considerable amount of respect. Right, if I told you, hey, you guys should all respect me, right, at that moment, all I managed to do, right, is make everyone respect me even less. Right, it's kind of like when you meet someone for the first time and you really want to make a good impression, right? Oftentimes, the more you want to make a good impression, right, the less of a good impression you're actually making, right? The more you care about what other people think about you, the more it makes people wonder what is going on with you, right? In some ways, the very best way to gain respect, right, is to simply live a life that is worthy of it. Right, this is what it's trying to show us, right? Don't go demand respect, simply live a life that is deserving of respect. And so, if we kind of take this whole incident as a whole, once again, we see the values of the kingdom of this world. Right, Xerxes, what we really see in Xerxes, right, is a complete abuse of power. This is the danger of having one person have this much power, because what he did is he used everything at his disposal for his own gain. Right, to gain respect, to gain power, to gain glory. Now, while none of us, I think, unless you guys are secretly hiding, some bank account somewhere, like none of us probably, don't have as much wealth and power that Xerxes had. But are we also not tempted at times, right, to use the wealth, to use the power, to use the advantages that we have for our own gain? Right, are we also tempted at times to live for our own glory and our own honor? Right, to use our power, to use our money all for ourselves? Right? Never mind, or not caring what harm it might do to other people. And so you see, this is the brilliance of Esther, right? Because it's through humor and irony, she's showing us just how foolish it is and how dangerous and how harmful it is to keep going down the path that Xerxes was going down. Right? And I think the application point is, will we use our wealth and power the way King Xerxes does? Or will we use it the way Jesus does? Right, who has all the wealth in the universe, has all the power in the universe, right, yet uses it to serve us and to love us. And so let me close with this. I think once again we can compare the actions of Xerxes with that of Jesus, because Xerxes, right, he wants to parade his wife out in front of his friends, right, not caring at all about the humiliation and the shame that it would make her feel. But how does King Jesus care for his church? Right? How does King Jesus care for his bride? Well, in Ephesians, right, it says, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless." You see, while King Xerxes made his wife, Queen Vashti, feel shame, Jesus on the cross, he takes our shame and he gives us honor. Right? Jesus on the cross, he takes our guilt and he makes us clean. Right? Whatever shame, whatever uncleanliness that we feel, right, as people, as sinners, right, out there in the world, right, people will just not care about that. But Jesus, he takes our shame, he takes our guilt, and gives us honor and beauty, washes us, cleanses us, and makes us into this radiant church one day who will be presented before him. And so let us not chase after the things of this world, right, in the similar way that King Xerxes does, which only results really in harm for others. But let's use whatever wealth, whatever power that God might have given to us for the sake of serving others. Why? Because we follow the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, who is humble enough to serve us. Let's pray together. God, we thank you that we're able to spend this brief time just meditating upon your word. We thank you that your word is so rich and continues to fill us with such hope, and your word is also so real to us in the sense that it shows us what is the truth about this world. It shows us the truth behind power and the truth behind wealth. It shows the truth behind human relationships. It shows us the folly of chasing after these things, and it shows us the wisdom, the true wisdom of following you. Father, may we be convicted in our hearts to live our lives for you, for your glory, because we know that this is what you have made us for. This is what you have created us to be in relationship with you. And Father, help us see as we walk through this book of Esther that following you is going to result in our greatest joy, in our greatest, and find our greatest happiness, not in chasing after the things of this world, but finding our rest and our trust and our hope